Our guest tonight is Reverend Bill Shaw, and he's an ordained Presbyterian minister. Grew up in Belfast. He was born in Sandy Row, which is a pretty strong Protestant neighborhood just outside the city center in Belfast. And I think Bill will tell you that, growing up in Sandy Row was an experience because it was, an area where the Orange Order was pretty prominent. On the 12th of July, there were parades, and the whole place was decked out with pictures of King Billy. And he lived there till the age of 12. Then his folks moved outside of the suburbs of Belfast. And then Bill later on worked in construction. And at age 26, he had a personal conversion, went to Queen's University where he earned a degree in theology. And his first church was on the Shankill Road. And the Shankill Road, as you all know, is also a pretty hardcore Protestant area. It would be the largest part of West Belfast that's Protestant. And after that, he was called to a church out in Craigavon, which is south of Belfast, near Portadown, which is almost synonymous with the Orange Order and the conflict the Orange Order has had over marching down Crivaki Road, which is a Catholic neighborhood. And I bring this all into focus because at this point, Bill began to question the principles of Protestants who were using the Orange Order perhaps for political purposes, for cultural purposes, and perhaps behaving in a way that he didn't see as being in keeping with Christianity as he understood it. And Bill then decided that he would take a whole different tack in his life. And instead of being a minister in a church, he decided that he would create a new ministry, in effect, and work with Catholics in the New Lodge Road, which is just north of the city center in Belfast, and probably again about as hardcore Catholic, nationalist Catholic Republican as Sandy Row would have been on the other side. And I joked yesterday when I introduced Bill that he now, on a daily basis, is meeting with former members of the Provisional IRA, probably hanging around with people his own mother may not approve of, because his parents may not be in the same position as you are as far as the conflict. So I'd like to first of all ask him some questions, and then as this develops, the floor is open for questions from you as well. Tell us, if you will, and I'll just call him Bill because he doesn't. Reverend Shaw seems to be perhaps too formal for Bill. Tell us a bit about your life growing up in Sandy Row and what it was like.
Well, can I say, first of all, just for the record, I don't live with my parents. I'm married. I got three, so I use my mum as a yardstick quite often, but I do not live with my parents. I'm married and I live in the suburbs of North Belfast. But Bill's right. I mean, my mum in particular has issues with what I do. But anyway. So you want to, growing up, as you said, I mean, I grew up in the 60s. I was a 60s child. I remember Belfast before the Troubles. The area that I grew up in was indeed a hardline loyalist area that was indeed bedecked with bunting and streamers at the 12th of July. But there were murals of King Billy all year round. I mean, the gable walls were painted even then, but it was more a cultural expression, I suppose, of Protestantism. And 11th of July, the bonfires, and 12th of July parades. Those are very much highlights in the year for the community. I don't remember them being so much a celebration of, as they became, of anti-Catholicism. That's not how I remember them. They were more just a community event. I would have been largely unaware of Catholics. I went to school, and all my school was at the bottom of the street, so all the people that I went to school with were Protestants. The people I played with were Protestants. When I went to what we call secondary school at age 11, 12, again, it was a state school. All my friends at school were Protestants. Every circle of friends I had included only Protestants. I often say that I didn't meet or didn't have a meaningful engagement with the Catholic until I was 17. And I was at Technical College, and I had a Saturday job in a downtown store. And I met a guy called Sean who happened to be Catholic and lived in a different part of Belfast. And this is in 1972-73, statistically the most violent period of our troubles, when the city centre would have closed at 6 o'clock, and buses would come off the road, and shutters, the steel gates would have, security gates would have closed the entire city centre off at 6 o'clock, basically. So the whole inner city shut down. So we would quite often go for a beer after work, and then he would get the bus home to his Catholic part of Belfast, and I would get the bus home to where I lived, and then would go out with my friends, all of whom were Protestant. I don't ever remember at any of the. You still go to discos, discos, right? So because we're talking about 70s here, so I mean discos again. I'm quite sure at some of the discos I went to, there might have been Catholics, but that would have been very rare because people tended to socialise still with their own. So, as I say, Sean was really my first contact, if that sort of brings us far enough.
Sure did. How about your parents and your peer group? What kind of influence did they have on you, especially in it relates to Protestants, Catholics, staying in your own part of town, not going other places, stories you might have heard?
I think my folks, I was privileged in that my folks were, in spite of the jokes I make about my mum, and I make them to her face as well, my folks are fairly balanced. A lot of the men, my dad worked for what became British Telecom. In those days it was Post Office, and a lot, in fact probably most of his college would have been Catholic. I don't remember meeting them so much. I mean, they wouldn't have come to our house because of where we lived. So I wasn't allowed to use the F word, as in Fenian, not the other F word. You were thinking of another word, I know, but I wouldn't say that on camera. No. So whereas Fenian was something that people would have talked about, even though we didn't have contact with them. But I remember distinctly that was not a word that I was allowed to use in the house.
What reason?
I surmise because a lot of my dad's friends that he worked with were Catholic, so that wouldn't have been something that and they would have tried to bring us up in that way. But once you went out in the street, I mean, it was different, and but again, because of the fact that it was really only when you went to senior school, that was the rites of passage. The really attractive thing in going to senior school was it was built on what became a peace line. It was right on the line of demarcation between the Protestant area in which I lived and a Catholic area, the Lower Falls, the Grosvenor Road. So the really neat thing, I thought, in my last year of junior school, in primary school, was going to the big school, because you knew that at the big school, most afternoons you would get to fight with Catholics. Because there was a local Catholic school, and this is before '69. I went to senior school, secondary school, in 1967. So the troubles hadn't started, but you still knew that most I seem to have this recollection, most afternoons, maybe once a week, the Catholics from St. Peter's School would come down and position themselves, and whichever school got out first got the high ground, literally the high ground, and collected the stones, the ammunition, and then you waited, and then the Catholic school would come and you would throw stones, and then when you get tired, you go home and play football or do homework. Well, maybe not so much.
Familiar faces, you saw the same people?
Well, you were never that close enough. It was only the really brave guys that and there was some hand to hand. I mean, it was like gladiators. Sometimes someone would emerge to champion either side, and there'd be a hand-to-hand combat, and everybody cheering. But I wasn't brave enough or foolish enough to do that. But that was
reasons would they offer? Why were we going
you didn't need a reason. They were just they were Fenians. We were Protestants, and that's what they did. Even before the Troubles, it was a normal thing. We got a question?
Yes, Fenians. Is that a sort of a derogatory word?
Very much so. Yeah.
Defining the word Fenian.
Yeah, it is. It has historical connotations as well, but we didn't think of the history. It was just something that you would say. That they're Fenians. It was a derogatory term.
How was it talking down about something like we talk down about the Iraqis? There's a term used for Iraqis.
Yeah.
What is it? What is it referred to?
It would just the Fenian movement was there was a rebellion, and Bill's probably more an expert than I am. I'm thinking in the 19th century there was a Fenian rebellion and an uprising, and the Fenian Brotherhood and sort of precursors to the IRA, if you will. And Catholics actually would look on it as a badge of honour. They're actually T-shirts, unreconstructed Fenian. I don't know, have you seen those in Belfast?
Indeed,
So it's a badge of honour for them. But for us, it was a way of, as you say, it was a derogatory term.
It was.
It was just a way of saying that they were less than we were. And that was just common parlance. I mean, people would have used that language. But in the house, in my home, I wasn't allowed to use that word. But we didn't need a reason. I mean, there really wasn't a reason. We just knew that they hated us and we hated them. And that's what you did.
What influence, if any, would there have been from the churches during that period? Or would that not be spoken of?
I wouldn't have been a big churchgoer, and that's probably the understatement of it. I would have went to Sunday school, I think, as a small child, but as soon as possible, I opted out of that. So my knowledge of what went on in the churches is large. Certainly in the 60s is largely secondhand. I remember going to infrequently with my dad on a Sunday night, but church was anyway. But and you and I have talked about this, and I've written a piece for hopefully for publication in a larger book that focuses on what I feel are the shortcomings of the churches, Protestant and Catholic, particularly during the 60s. And I've talked at length with people who were there at the time. I've actually preached about it, which has met with mixed reception. But my theory is that the churches basically just got on with doing church. And they didn't address the issues on the ground. They certainly didn't address sectarianism. They didn't address the prejudice that was widespread. They didn't address the discrimination in jobs and in housing. They certainly in the Protestant churches, one would have thought that someone might have spoken up about social justice issues, such as discrimination, given that the Unionist government had almost a free rule and a free reign in running the country for 50 years. Nationalists talk about 50 years of Unionist misrule. I used to remember my mum, she used to really get angry when commentators or nationalists would be on the radio and talk about 50, it was not misrule. And so we've since had conversations around that where I've tried to tactfully say to her that it really was. I mean, it was all of that. But the churches were, I think with maybe one or two notable exceptions, they were largely silent on those issues. I tend to think and would have hoped that if the churches had been playing the prophetic role that I think the church should do in any society, in any generation, it might have gone some way in addressing the I suppose the complaints, and that's a polite way, and the demands of nationalists and Catholics. And if those, if their concerns and their grievances had been listened to, even, and the civil rights movement in the mid to late 60s, if they had been taken seriously, and maybe even the churches, as happened in the States, with Martin Luther King and the churches backing him. If a similar movement and a similar backing had have come from the churches, perhaps the troubles, the war that erupted in 1969 and 1970 might not have happened. And I think that the churches are in some small way culpable in the violence that erupted on the streets, because they didn't address the situation. And then when the violence erupted, of course, the churches wrung their hands and complained. We got a question here, and then we'll
Okay. Yes.
I don't know if you have this on your syllabus, but when did the influence of Ian Paisley start to
Just going to ask that briefly.
come in to like the Protestant mindset?
Okay.
and
Questions
affect-
about Ian Paisley and when he came into the picture,
Yeah.
and what he did, perhaps.
Can I recommend that new book? Am I allowed?
Yeah, sure.
If you can,
Oh,
you
yeah.
probably have to get it on Amazon. There's a brand new book
Yeah.
by and again someone that Bill knows, Ed Maloney, who's a journalist and author, who has written widely on it. And this is brand new. It was literally, I think it was just published last month, and I'm probably a little bit more than halfway through it. Fascinating book. I mean, it really traces his middle of the 1940s. Basically, Paisley started to. He came on the scene as a firebrand preacher, I think is Ed Maloney's favourite phrase, a fundamentalist preacher around, I'm thinking 1948, he was about 8, I'm thinking he's about 18 then, he's what, 82 now, you can do the maths. But he started preaching around then. I think he was already politicised to some degree. But again, those would have been days basically when Catholics would have kept their heads down. You know, there was no opposition in government, and Catholics basically just got on with life. They didn't cause any trouble. The IRA had sporadic campaigns, the early 50s, the mid 50s, the late 50s, but generally speaking, the vast majority of Catholics, they didn't really, there was no agitation towards civil rights, but Paisley painted up the story. You know, he stirred up those sort of feelings because it fitted his agenda. You know, he 1951 he started up his own denomination. He painted it as a split in the Presbyterian Church, but it wasn't. But he formed the Free Presbyterian Church. But he was essentially a Baptist preacher, you know, with Baptist leanings, and started up his own denomination. And then he realised that if he mixed some politics in with his fundamentalist theology, that's a potent mix in any society. Whether he, I tend to think, because he's a clever guy, and I tend to think that that was part of his agenda. So the mix of fundamentalist theology and politics, starting up his own denomination, planting churches, drawing away largely disaffected Presbyterians, and talking about the bogeyman that was south of the border. You know, the Free State, the Irish government, and you know, he could have talked in very colourful language about the priest-ridden state, you know, home rule, Rome rule, all of that that had again historical resonance. But his influence started in the late 40s, beginning of the 50s. Is this because I'm just
Follow-up question?
Follow up, yeah. Did it affect your neighborhood at all, or your family?
Did you ever hear people quoting him in your neighborhood?
not it. I mean, and again, I said as a child of the '60s, I was born in '56. You know, I'll own up. I know I don't like it, but I was. I have my earliest recollection is seeing Paisley in the street next to mine on the back of a flat back truck, and there were bands and I tend to think reading Maloney's book, because he didn't stand for election until 1970, 71, I think, but he was an election agent from the 50s for Unionists and Protestants, and that's, you know, and he would have whipped up the crowd. He, you know, and he did a pretty good job. And I have a recollection of I'm thinking it was around 62, 63. It might have been 63, 64, but early 60s. Anyway, that was my first recollection of him. And that's really when his reputation started to soar in working class communities.
Yes.
Yeah,
Further
we-
question?
The unionist rule of 50 years, who were the unionists?
The Unionists were Protestant. They're terms that are used interchangeably. Unionists were Protestants who wanted to retain the link with the United Kingdom, and hence they were Unionists. And their loyalty is variously described. Sometimes it's described as to the British Crown, to the King or the Queen. In some cases it's to England, but it's probably less to England, but they're Unionists in the sense that they wanted to retain the union of the United Kingdom and Northern Ireland. Did you have a question?
Yes.
Yeah, I had like a double question.
Okay,
on
double
when
question.
we moved forward really quick, but in your opinion, why do you think the church didn't become involved either side? And then the second part would be for Paisley, why do you think, in your opinion, was he doing this for the good of his people, or was he doing it for ego?
If you could repeat these, they're good
Yeah,
questions, both of them.
they're really good
Repeat
questions.
each one of them.
The first question related to why did the churches not get involved and why did they not speak out? Can I answer that first of all? And you'll remind me about the second one anyway. I can't talk with any first-hand experience, and I might be off track here, but I don't think the churches, and by that I mean the Presbyterian Church, the Episcopalian Church, which is the Church of Ireland, the Baptist Church would be fairly strong. The Presbyterian Church numerically is the strongest, and then the Catholic Church. And there's a tendency just to really preach to your own. And certainly within the mainstream Protestant denominations are in the main middle class. You know, and I think there was probably a pattern that was established prior to the 60s, but certainly became firmly established during the 60s, and it maintained that right through the Troubles. They basically, they stayed aloof from the Troubles, from the issues that were on the ground. There was I suppose a hesitance in addressing it because it would have opened up a can of worms. And within the Protestant psyche in general, there was a reluctance to question the state, because that's to whom we owed our loyalty. So anything, difficult questions like that would have called into question, I think, the foundation of society. So there was perhaps a fear.
And did the churches become more important because of the conflict?
Did they become more important because of the
If
conflict?
there hadn't been a conflict, the churches wouldn't have been.
That's an argument that I think has some merit, in that I suppose it tended in some cases to retain a loyalty of the people because it was part of their identity that may have been threatened. I tend not to think, because there's still we have the highest percentage of church-going people in Western Europe, in Northern Ireland. And certainly, as I've written, the highest number of those people who claim to be born-again Christians in Western Europe. And that throws up other issues as well, but that's a whole other discussion. So you were asking me then, the question was whether Paisley had a political agenda or whether it was an ego.
Yeah, was it really truly for the good? Did he feel like he was doing all this for the good of his people, or was it more an egotistical kind of thing, or both, or did it develop
That's really
more?
interesting.
Okay, whether it was for the good of his people or whether it was purely an ego-driven agenda. The short answer is probably both, but he would, because both are interconnected. He has seen himself from the very beginning. Edward Carson, is that a name that you're familiar with in the original Home Rule crisis? There is a statue of Edward Carson right outside Stormont Buildings. It's an iconic statue, and I would tend to think that from day one, Paisley saw him as the natural successor to Lord Carson, someone who would be a defender of Protestantism and the Protestant people. And he felt then, whether he still feels that now is another question we'll come to, But he certainly felt then, and right up until the 26th of March last year, would have been convinced that the best thing for the Protestant people was a Northern Ireland that with a border that was secure and with links to the United Kingdom. He would have seen that, because his fear was that if the border was removed and Ireland was reunified, then Protestants would be at the mercy of the Roman Catholic Church. That's the sort of tenor of his speeches and his sermons, and that was the last thing in the world that he felt that his people needed. Can I also say, in the interest of fairness, and just in case he ever watches this, it's also said in Northern Ireland that his Catholic constituents would have always said that he was very fair in his dealings with them. If they came to him with constituency matters and grievances, he was always very adamant that he was a member appointed for all his constituency. But in his preaching and in his ecclesiastical duties, it was very much Protestantism that he was, and he was a bulwark against Catholicism and against the United Ireland.
How real is that fear today that United Ireland will be dominated by the Roman Catholic Church?
Why don't you repeat that question?
The question was how real is the fear today that a United Ireland would still be dominated by the Catholic Church? I don't think it's nearly as real as it was, even amongst, well, leaving aside the diehard Paisley supporters who have listened to him for 50 years talk that up. And there are a number of reasons. I mean, the Republic of Ireland is a much more secular society than it was 20 years ago. It's certainly much more economically vibrant. I mean, the Celtic Tiger has transformed the fortunes of a sizable proportion. There's a gap between the haves and the have-nots, and that's getting wider, and there are issues for the Southern government that they're aware of. But with the constitutional changes too that took place as part of the Good Friday Agreement, that allayed the fears, and I think also prepared the way for the agreement in 1998. So the society in the Republic of Ireland, south of the border, has changed out of all recognition, and that has helped. I mean, there are lots of former combatants, Protestant paramilitaries that I know that go down regularly to Dublin and to other places, and that wouldn't have happened before. Excursions over the border were seen as trips into enemy territory, and people wouldn't have, if you had to travel through the south, the challenge for Northern Protestants was to spend as little as you could so that it didn't go to there. Now the challenge, because it's so expensive in the south, the challenge is to keep your money, but for different reasons. Is that a sufficient answer? Okay.
Yes.
Just another question. I was baptized Episcopal myself, but if there's the Protestant Church and the Catholic Church, yet the Episcopal Church is the Church of Ireland, where is it? What side is it?
What side is the Church of Ireland?
The Episcopal Church.
It's a Protestant church.
It's a Protestant church.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, and it because it's
Oh,
but my denomination is the Presbyterian Church in Ireland.
Yeah.
They are the Church of Ireland. You can make of that what you will, but I think it speaks to the psyche of what they called the Protestant ascendancy, the English that colonised Ireland. So they give it the name the Church of Ireland.
Yes.
Yeah.
Do the Anglicans and the Presbyterians get along for the most part in Northern
No,
Ireland?
now they do. Yeah, the question was, do the Anglicans, do the Episcopalians and the Presbyterians get along? They do now. Historically, they didn't. I'm not sure how far back you've
We've
gone.
talked a bit about that.
But when when the Presbyterians came, we were largely, I say we because that would be my heritage. We would be Ulster Scots. I mean, my ancestors would have come from Scotland at the time of the plantation, the Elizabethan plantation, in the mid-17th century. The first Presbyterian ministers came as part of the chaplains in the army, in the Scottish regiments that came across to quell the rebellion of 1641. And they wanted then to worship as they had worshipped in Scotland. And even in Scotland, they were persecuted by the Episcopalian Church. So there was this struggle historically between Presbyterianism and the Episcopalian Church. So when they came to Northern Ireland, when they came to Ulster, to be correct, then they wanted to set up and worship according to the Presbyterian form of worship. So there was pressure then from the Church of Ireland bishops, and Presbyterian ministers were expelled from the country and so on. And then the penal laws that effectively disenfranchised Catholics to a lesser extent also disenfranchised Presbyterians. And it really probably wasn't until the Act of Union, in the immediate aftermath of the Act of Union, 1801,
right.
And that period that I think a concerted attempt was made to woo the Presbyterians in order to prevent any realignment with Republicans and with nationalists. But today, people talk about the Protestant churches, and they tend to get on.
It sounds like there's a pretty high percentage of Presbyterians. Like with Ian Paisley being Presbyterian, it sounds like they're pretty.
Well, can I clarify that he's actually Free Presbyterian?
Oh, okay.
Very different.
It's a totally different. I tend to think, and you might want to edit this. He's neither free, his church is neither free nor is it Presbyterian. That's a personal expression, but anyway. But he said his mother came from a Scottish Covenanting background. That's where he claims he gets his Presbyterianism from. But he, as I say, his father was a Baptist preacher, and that was essentially the tradition that he was brought up in. But again, going back to an earlier question, in setting up his own denomination, he saw that he had a ready-made audience and a ready-made denomination amongst disaffected Presbyterians to whom he addressed a lot of his preaching. And his pattern of ministry and that of his ministers has been divisive. If they find a Presbyterian congregation anywhere in Northern Ireland where there was the least inkling of controversy or disagreement within the congregation, they would come and do some preaching. And in order to drive a wedge in and then draw those folks away. As I say, statistically, the Presbyterian Church in Ireland is the largest Presbyterian or Protestant denomination in Ireland. Paisley's denomination is much smaller.
So the Presbyterian Church, like what you're a reverend with, is actually larger than the Anglican Church.
It is.
Okay.
It is.
In the north.
In the north.
In the south.
And if you take the whole of Ireland, I tend to think that because the Protestant population in the south of Ireland is minuscule, it's very, very small. I tend to think, and I wouldn't be speaking with any degree of authority in a whole of Ireland context, but I tend to think we're probably still numerically the strongest Protestant church in Ireland.
Yeah. Let's talk a bit more about Ian Paisley and the event of 1964. Tell us about the flag on the Falls Road, the tricolor flag that was in the window, and what Reverend Paisley did, and what happened as a result.
Well, again, it's and on a personal note, my dad is convinced. I don't know. He talks regularly about this, that we were coming back. He and my younger brother, we were in a car coming back from a swimming pool over in a Protestant, and we were coming back home. We lived quite near the Falls Road. Now he's convinced we got caught up in the riot. I don't have any. I was 8 at the time. He describes it in quite harrowing terms that we were caught up in this ruckus, and it got really scary, and he was concerned with us. Who am I to argue with my dad? But whether we were there or not, I don't, but it happened. I mean, there was in a shop front window. I think it was an electoral office for one of it may have been Sinn Féin. It was displayed. Given what I said, Paisley's was building up some momentum at that stage, and the least, the smallest excuse he could find, he would have started a riot. I mean, he marched everywhere. I mean, anything to get a crowd gathering. So he had rallies here, there, and everywhere, and he picketed the General Assembly of the Presbyterian Church every year. He would have marched his people because he claimed that we were Roman sympathizers. The ecumenical movement he saw as the spawn of Satan, and he would have paraded, and the opening night of the General Assembly when other dignitaries from other churches, all of whom were Protestant, I mean, he would have picketed that. I think the first time he went, certainly one of the early times that he was charged, they threatened the moderator of General Assembly, and he was charged with disturbing the peace. On this particular incident, the flag was displayed, and he let it be known that if the RUC, if the police didn't move in and forcibly remove it, of course he knew if the police moved in and forcibly, there would be a riot, but it would be the Catholics who would get hammered and and all of that. So he basically was blackmailing the authorities. And he was saying that if you don't go in and remove it, we will go in and remove it. And by that he meant he would get a crowd of people from the Shankill or some other hardline loyalist, and they would march in and take it away. So the RUC didn't really want to go in, and again, I'm assuming that because they didn't charge in straight away. And then Paisley started a march, and ultimately the RUC did remove it, and Paisley got what he wanted. There was a riot for like 2 days. They rioted on the falls.
You may remember we noted last week that 10 years earlier, 1954, a law was passed that made it illegal to show any other flag but the Union flag.
But the Union flag.
So this was an Irish tricolor. And some people would say that the Reverend Paisley may have been responsible for the beginning of the Troubles. What would you say?
Well, my dad firmly believed, he actually said as much as that. A couple of weeks ago, as I say, and I mean, I didn't realize this question was going to come up. I go and see my folks on a Saturday afternoon, and we'll chat about stuff that's as non-controversial as possible.
Mm-hmm.
But that he said as much as that a couple of weeks ago. As I said, he started talking about it. I think maybe one of my sons had come over for the afternoon, and he was telling him the story of how when I was small we got caught up. And I think he said that on that particular occasion that was the spark. I think probably with some justification that could well have been said. But the tensions were mounting. I mean, because you had a growing middle-class Catholic educated community who were no longer content to consider themselves second-class citizens. They wanted equal rights as they saw it. So that was already beginning to bubble, or at least to simmer anyway. And this was certainly one of those that turned up the temperature. It certainly was. Yeah.
So it's pretty safe to say that he's abusing his power as, or the effect he had over his people religiously for political gain. When it seems that religion is based around caring about people and not judging other people based on the judging is just as much as a sin, and all sins are created equal. So how did he justify to his people that were?
Like restate that.
Yeah, and again, that's an excellent question because that's part of my own struggle. The question was that why foment and stir up trouble and dissension, and when religion should be about caring and compassion and being non-judgmental. That's something that he's going to have to answer for. But he would say, again, going back to the earlier question, he would say that maintaining a Protestant witness, which is probably a phrase that would have been on his lips, resisting I'm trying not to be provocative because he used the most colourful language to talk about Catholics, their faith, their bishops, their priests. I mean, some of the most incredible phrases he is used publicly. And one would say at the very least they're unchristian. Why he would do that, all I can say is, that his reading of the scriptures is different from mine, or else his Bible is different from mine. I know there is a book I read by a Methodist. He's a former president of the Methodist Church. He also taught me church history when I was at Queen's, Dennis Cook. It's a book called Persecuting Zeal. It's about Paisley. It's not really balanced, and he doesn't make any pretense at being balanced. But he relates the story, and he has it in good authority, that passage about loving your neighbour, that Paisley not only never preached it, he refused to allow his ministers to preach it. And when one did pick it as a text, he was disciplined. I'm saying that because it was repeated in a book. It may not be true, but it's in the book. But I think it goes to the heart of the matter, that if you're loving your neighbour as you should, then the things that he said wouldn't be.
Yeah, it just doesn't seem. Just between religions, it just doesn't seem.
Well, we'd probably come on, because that's part of the struggle later in my life.
Is trying to figure out how being practiced in the Bible and stuff, if this can even happen, that he can basically turn it around and use it for his own good to cause trouble when.
But there was a time in my life I would have been sympathetic to his position, his theological position as well. I got to say that. I hold my hands up. And part of the journey that I'm on, that it was those sort of thoughts that started occurring in my mind. Well, I came to that there's something wrong with the picture here. You can't preach hate and be a Christian. I got to say that's my premise. And whatever the faults or feelings doctrinally, theologically of the other side, I still tend to think that if we do as Jesus did, then we major on compassion and forgiveness, and we don't judge.
Yeah, and it seems like that's what it's about, is judging. He's judging them for being Roman Catholic, which is, if he thinks it's a sin, it's just as much a sin to judge in his own Bible, whether Bible he's reading, if it's a Christian Bible.
I guess, as you've already said, he was tapping on something that was already there.
As I say, it was a mixture of fundamentalist theology, and well, in different parts of the world we know that, but he mixed that then with politics in our context, and again, that's something that in the US you know a lot about as well. But what he also did then, he didn't, as the other church leaders did, he didn't confine that to the church and to the pulpit. He saw the street as his pulpit, so he took that out onto the streets. And as I say, if he could find an excuse to have a rally or to have a march for anything, he did it to whip up the crowd.
And he has a voice that's like it's loudspeaker built into his cheeks, right?
Yeah, he's incredible.
He can
incredible volume.
Yes, another question over here.
This guy.
Yeah.
First.
Well, you mentioned that the Free Presbyterians was sort of the creation of basically his own denomination, and he's using it as a political agenda. Do you think it will survive past that?
That's a good question.
A good question. Will the Free Presbyterian Church survive after Paisley has gone? The Free Presbyterian Church is in a state of turmoil at the moment. For the first time since it was formed, they have a new moderator. Again, in the proper Presbyterian Church, if that doesn't sound too arrogant, in the Presbyterian Church now, our moderator is voted in every year, so it's a different moderator each year. In the Free Presbyterian Church, they've always had Paisley. He's been the moderator for 50 years, pretty much. Because of his agreement last year with Jerry Adams to go into government with Sinn Féin, his church basically let it be known that they were unhappy. So he voluntarily, quote unquote, stepped down. The feeling is that basically he jumped before he was pushed. He stepped down lest there be a leadership challenge. So the question is, will it survive? It probably will. It won't have the influence. I mean, it punched above its weight for so long. I mean, numerically, it's quite small, but they've got loud preachers and they preach in the open air. But there is no one with the charisma. What everyone thinks of Paisley, he has got charisma in bucket loads. And there is no one within his church nor within his political party that's quite in that league. So they will survive. But I tend to think they're becoming increasingly irrelevant. And you know they've already tried in recent past to move away from politics. They're trying, and even before he did he made the agreement, they have been trying to slowly distance themselves from politics. So they will probably continue as a relatively small and perhaps insignificant sect. Get this guy.
Yes.
Would it be fair to describe Ian Paisley as a coward, seeing how he used impressionable young Protestants to fight his battles for him, while he would just speak about these leprechauns or whatever you wanted to call Catholics, and then he'd stay out of the battles, but he'd let however many thousands die.
Want to repeat that?
Yeah. Do I think that Dr. Paisley was a coward, and that he whipped up the crowd and he got people involved in stuff that he himself stayed aloof from? Again, I recommend Ed Maloney's book, and he would definitely be of that opinion. That again, from the mid-60s, the first bombs that exploded in 1966 that were initially blamed, or they tried to blame it on the IRA, were actually what became UVF. It became apparent that afterwards that they were UVF bombs, but they were deliberately planted and exploded to try and blame it on the IRA and therefore taint the emerging civil rights movement. And the people who planted those bombs would definitely say that Paisley's influence was significant. But he's always been careful to make sure that when there were meetings, and Ed Maloney lists them, I mean, he actually lists meetings at which the bombing targets were going to be mentioned. On one occasion, he took a guy, he picked up this guy, brought him to a house where they were going to be discussing, and he left him, went away somewhere, presumably to a prayer meeting, and then came back and picked the guy up and took him all the way back to Belfast. Probably a journey there and back of probably a couple of hours. And Ed Maloney posits the question, well, what did they talk about in the car? Would it not have been reasonable to have even a polite discussion about what went on in the house? And it was in the house they were planning bombings. But certainly he's been careful, very careful, and very clever not to be involved. So no charge has ever, well, charges have been made. There have been civil disturbance charges, and there have been rumours, that he was responsible, but nothing has ever stuck.
I'd add to it that I know people who claim that they sat at a kitchen table in Paisley's kitchen and got recommendations as to where they could get guns and what they could do, and so even though he claims to have no involvement, there's a lot of evidence.
Well, the third force that he started up again, I'm thinking in the 80s with the Red Berets, and they went on military maneuvers. They literally went on maneuvers, marched. Well, they talk about him being like old King. He marched them up to the top of the hill, and the certain key loyalist paramilitaries feel aggrieved that he marched them in metaphorical terms and sometimes in literal terms, marched them to the top of the hill, and then when they went over the top, he went back down the hill. But on that occasion, when they had their red berets, they actually waived their firearms certificates. It was a threat. I mean, they were basically threatening the government without actually waiving the guns. They waived their firearms certificates, and he was letting it be known that this is an army.
And the man who's now taking over in Paisley's position as first minister also was there that day with the red beret on, Peter Robinson. So you had a question.
Yeah, I'm just wondering, I'm assuming with his power that he had a target on his head, I would assume. And so I'm just wondering how he made it. And did he have any attempts on his life? That kind of thing.
Repeat the question. I have a comment to make on that.
Yeah,
too.
okay.
Or-
Given his vitriolic attacks and the way he went about doing what he did, was he a target, and were there ever any assassination attempts? Again, Bill, but I mean, if I were on the other side, I would just let him go and do what he does, because they said that he was the best and most effective recruiting sergeant for the IRA.
That's the statement I was.
Was that?
The same thing.
Okay?
Recruiting sergeant for
They
the
would
IRA.
say it, because he would get up and he would shout, and I mean, as I say, the things that he said were just incredibly offensive. So why shut him up?
I asked Paisley the same question. He claimed, there were many, many attempts on his life, but I don't recall a creditable one that I was
No,
aware of.
I'm not aware of one.
Yeah, another question.
I'm wondering if a lot of the charges are like Paisley, like influencing the youth and keeping it politically free, could we apply these to Jerry Adams on the other hand? That's sort of the same tactics.
Okay.
Repeat that if you would.
The question, the charges that have been levelled against Paisley as someone who whipped up unrest and got young people involved could also have been levelled against Jerry Adams. That's a real good question. Again, I would have to say, by way of factual accuracy, Jerry Adams has never been charged. He was interned for a while, but he was never, as far as I'm aware, you might want to correct me, I'm pretty sure that he was never charged, officially charged. There has been attempts in the last year, since the agreement actually, to link him to the murder of 2 policemen, in that his fingerprints were found in a car that was burned out, that was the getaway car. But it seemed a strange coincidence that as soon as the agreement to go into power with Sinn Féin was announced, that these accusations that dated back to the 70s would surface. But whether he and you're saying that as leader of, because again, he's always denied membership of the IRA.
Never ever claimed to be a member,
So we're again.
I'm curious about
but
it.
everyone knows he was.
But everyone knows he influenced the IRA in some way.
He was in the
especially with the
He
Sinn
was
Féin.
Belfast commander, right?
So
You guys can say I'm going back to Belfast. But yes, I think that, as they say, the dog's in the street.
Yeah, dogs in the street.
So I'm leery that his hands are as clean as, I mean, I was just asking.
Well, I think,
About
and again, I'm often accused, believe it, I'm often accused of being an apologist for Sinn Féin because of where I work, and I'm seen as a traitor and all of that, So I don't want to confirm that suspicion in anyone's mind. He was active, okay, in whatever way you want to interpret that. He was active, and he did time. One of the books that I read, I think it's the Secret History of the IRA. I think that's it. Also Ed Maloney's book, and he talks at length about that. He makes a big thing of the point that while he was in leadership role, he never, as far as anyone could ever prove, he never fired a shot in anger. Okay, and the partnership with Martin McGuinness. Martin McGuinness has said that he did things, and that was, Jerry Adams seemed to get some authority from Martin McGuinness.
McGuinness and Adams would almost be the good cop and bad cop. McGuinness never claimed to have been an altar boy. I mean, he
No.
was a leader of the IRA in Derry.
And was
and
on the
he
streets
said
on
he
Bloody
was-
Sunday.
yeah, he's the hard man, and Adams has always been the political person. So the two of them together get along very well and complement each other.
And that in the Secret History of the IRA, and from my readings, I would tend to think that that's how they've done what they've done in moving the physical force Republicans away and wedded it to democracy. I have a lot of admiration, and I've said that publicly back home for what he has done. I mean, I don't know what he did because, as I say, you know, but in moving the Republic, and certainly, I think maybe from the end of the 70s, certainly the beginning of the 80s, I think he had a clear strategy in mind.
Incidentally, Bill not only lived through these times, he knew these people. He knows these people. I put it in the present tense that we're talking about. He knows Jerry Adams and Martin McGuinness and Paisley and other people we haven't talked about that he also knows, and has met with them personally many times, and they've come to his
Well, Paisley's I've been to his office. He's never
he's
come
not
to
come to
mine.
yours.
But Jerry Adams has, and Martin McGuinness, and some of those guys I like more than others.
Yes. Another question.
Well, I'm certainly not a biblical scholar, but it's just it's so the situation of claiming the different faiths, and I mean I know that like whether it's the King James Bible or the Catholic Bible. I know that rooted in New Testament, the troubles, all that stuff is so not the message of Christ. Yet they're acting, and I think that's kind of just hearing a little bit of like your history. I think that's kind of what you're trying to do, like with your church, with the ecumenical work and the church there is that the New Testament, you know, Christ's message was not, you know, killing your neighbor. You know, it was more about. I think maybe there's something where he talks about, you know, your faith will save you, not your religion. You know, it's more about, you know, what as opposed to, you know, waving these, you know, sides of as far as like different denominations.
So would your question be, how do you justify or
I guess it was just more of a statement. I guess my question would be, is that kind of like the work you're trying to bring out? A lot of the work that you've been doing in Belfast is really like, you know, along those lines?
Yeah, I think that it's exactly that. Well, I think just a little bit
Sure.
my own journey because
Yes,
it touches
yes.
on the question I got earlier on. And
Right.
but I mean, Bill has mentioned. I mean, I had a conversion experience when I was 26, coming from largely unchurched background, and I became a Christian. I mean, I became what I refer to now as a follower of Christ. And I'm not a saint. I mean, I'm going to get that on record. I mean, I've screwed up big time before it and after it. But in those days, one of our closest friends, my wife and I, this other young couple, we were a young couple, it was a mixed marriage, and Deirdre was Catholic. And when I became a Christian and started going to church and really took it seriously, Deirdre was really curious, you know, and she wanted to know, well, what's the difference? Because her mum went to chapel every day. You know, she was very religious. So I set myself a task of finding out what was the difference between my church, which is Presbyterian, and the Catholic Church. And that course of study over about a year led me to be pretty much where Paisley is and was. I mean, I was opposed to everything that was. I felt that they were wrong. I felt that there was a church in error. I felt they had blinded the people. All these things, and I set about trying to convert as many Catholics as I could. I would, because I was still working in construction. We haven't. I don't know if. I mean, if I was traveling the country as I did, going to different. I mean, I would have a supply of gospel tracts. Okay. And I would go to like Dungannon. I remember going to Dungannon. First thing I would do when I went into town, find a Catholic church, and I would go into the Catholic church, and where they had their mass cards and stuff, I would go in and insert these gospel tracts so that Catholics would come in and get these and go and get saved, and it would be great.
Continue on if you would.
Is this a point of clarification, or do you?
Well, actually, I was just kind of wondering, your argument with that, is it what you didn't agree with the Catholic Church, was it theology, or was it the hierarchy of the church like Martin Luther felt?
It was a bit of both.
Corruption.
Bit of both.
Okay.
Well, I wouldn't have, well, yeah, probably a bit of both.
Theology and both.
And both. I felt that doctrine, there were things that were wrong, you know, and I was right,
Mm-hmm.
you know, and there was that assurance, and that's where Protestantism has always stood on that. I mean, back to Martin, on this I stand, I can do no other, all
Right.
that. and one of there have been different things that have turned me around. I went into Ardoin Chapel one day. My wife lived. I don't think we were married.
When he talks about a chapel, he's talking about
a Catholic church. Sorry,
oh.
And it was actually Holy Cross. It's a Catholic church that dominates the skyline of North Belfast. So I parked the car and I walked up the steps and went in a side door and I had my tracts and I left the tracts in and I thought, and I looked at the statues and and just this air of superiority. I thought, these poor people, they're so ignorant, isn't it awful? And I've got the truth. And I couldn't find the door out. And this is literally the truth. The door I thought I'd come in was locked. This was a Wednesday afternoon. It was about 3 o'clock. I couldn't find the door. And I'm not exaggerating this at all. And I started to panic, because I thought Spanish Inquisition. I thought, if these Jesuits get me in this chapel, and I couldn't get out. I mean, I tried different doors and it was locked. And I was really not so much frightened for my life, but the statues, and it was really weird. And what I didn't notice the whole time I'd been in, there was this little woman down near the front praying. And she must have heard me rattling the doors, and she smiled, and she just smiled, and she pointed to this little door that obviously I had come in, but I couldn't see, and in my panic wasn't going to see, and she pointed, and I remember coming out into the daylight, and once the relief, and I thought, there's a woman in praying, and in the middle of the afternoon. And I thought, well, how many Protestants on the Shankill Road are praying at 3 o'clock in the afternoon? And it started to dawn on me, and I wouldn't want to jump ahead, but it started to dawn on me, well, okay, she's superstitious, and she's got her rosary beads, and she's looking at the statues, but she's praying. So that was the last time I ever left a tract in a Catholic church. No, I did. It wasn't a Damascus Road thing just yet. But I never left a tract again. I still thought I was right and they were wrong. But God was great. He dealt with that over a period of time. Because I finished my theology.
When we come back, would you talk more about your conversion and what happened during that period? Because
Okay.
we're going to take a break. And we'll just take a few minutes off and we'll come back and we'll talk more about this. You're touching on some really
Okay.
Okay, let's take a break.
Thanks.
In this second part, we wanted to talk a bit more about Reverend Bill Shaw and his journey. And he touched a bit on that before when he talked about what he did before he changed his mind. And perhaps I'll just defer to him and let him continue on talking about that church that you were in, that Catholic church that you went in, and then how this all changed and made your life change as a result.
Okay. Well, as I was saying, that Wednesday afternoon was the last time I had the cheek and the arrogance to leave tracts in Catholic churches. I could tell you other stories of what I did before that as well. One day I was driving up the Malone Road. You know where there was a convent just up above Queen's University as you drive up the Malone Road. So it was one Sunday I'd come out of church, my wife and the kids in the car, and we saw all these cars of obviously people who were at chapel worshipping at Mass, and I leafleted every window. I lifted the windscreen wiper and put it dry. So. But anyway, that day in Holy Cross was the last time. I've never told Aidan, the priest there is now a very good friend of mine, and we work together, and I've never told him that story. And I go up for lunch. There are 4 priests there, and I go up for lunch periodically with them. Ian Troy was the guy who was with me when I met the president. So I'll maybe tell him that. I'll pick up the courage someday to tell him that story. But there was still the arrogance that that I was right, that I and my church had this monopoly on the truth, and that would be a feeling that would be shared, I think, probably by most churches, Protestant and Catholic. We all think that we're right and everyone else is wrong. Anyway, I finished my theology. I graduated with my degree, and obviously my arrogance level, just increased just a little bit more. And I worked for 3 years on the Shankill Road, one of those orange areas. Again, very traditional, conservative, evangelical, almost, you might say, fundamentalist. And that was really where I was. That was the camp that I was in. And then I got a call in Presbyterian Church. A congregation, a group, will call their minister. It's very democratic, as Jerry Adams once told me. We're a very democratic church. And I went to 2 churches, went to be pastor of 2 churches in the Craigavon, Portadown area. In the Craigavon church, where we lived, all our neighbours for the first time were Catholic. It was a Catholic area. The church wanted to move us into a Protestant area, and my wife and I talked it over, and we felt that it might be good to live amongst Catholics. We weren't terribly sure why, but we just felt that. So for the first time in my life, my next door neighbour was Catholic, and all the kids that my sons played with were Catholic, and we would play soccer, and they would have sleepovers, and they would be Catholic, and it was great. And I would meet Catholics, and little by little, the sort of the blinkered life that I lived began to change, and I met Catholics, believe it or not, that I thought were Christians. Now there's a surprise, and that's still quite a. I mean, for me to say that back home, that would still cause an argument in many circles to even countenance the fact that Catholics could be called Christians. Is a big issue. We get one of the projects that I'm involved in is working with Presbyterian youth leaders in trying to encourage them to have contact with Catholic youth leaders, and we got into trouble from some hardliners in our denomination because we were suggesting that these Catholics were Christians. Shock horror. So I was meeting people and all of it I see now as preparation for the work that I'm doing. So can I
Sure,
move on
yes.
to that?
By all means.
Just one question before that. Were you active politically at all?
No.
During that time?
No, I had absolutely no interest in politics at all. Mine was I was operating on a much higher spiritual plane. I wouldn't have been worried about dirty things like saving the world. So the job at the organisation that I'm in, it was advertised in the paper, and my wife saw it and suggested that it would be. It seemed to be where I was going, because I should have said while I was in Graham, the Gravahi Road stuff happened. The Orange Order had caused the problems, and that was a big turning point in my life where I realised, as you had said, and as the guy down the back had said, that there was something wrong with what we were preaching or not preaching that could allow these things to happen on our streets.
Yeah, tell us a bit about Gravahi Road and the Orange Order and what was going on.
Well, the Orange Order started, it has its genesis in the Portadown area. That's where it came into being. Different people will give you different dates, but probably towards the mid to late 18th century, there was a battle, the Battle of the Diamond, between agricultural people, Protestants and Catholic secret societies, and the Orange Order came to being. And actually, one of the churches that I ministered in, the organist was Mrs. Winter, and it was Dan Winter's cottage that the Orange Order was founded. So there were those linkages. Gravahi Road, and there had always been trouble in Portadown. I mean, it's a deeply sectarian place, and I can, as someone who grew up in Sandy Row and had lived or worked in the Shankill Road, to say that somewhere is even more sectarian, that is saying something. Portadown is an incredibly sectarian place.
The southern part.
It's about 30 miles outside Belfast. Garvaghey Road was an area, a traditional route that the Orangemen on the first Sunday in July every year, to commemorate the Battle of the Somme, which was the first World War battle, where many Ulster Protestants and some Catholics died, but Protestant. It's one of those historic incidents that has shaped the psyche of Northern Protestants in a massive way. So they have this church parade to commemorate the Battle of the Somme, first Sunday in July every year. And the traditional route back is along the Garvaghey Road. So the way to the church, and it's a Church of Ireland Episcopalian Church, the way to the church is non-contentious because it's through Protestant areas, but the way back is through an area that is now Catholic with demographic change. The Orange Orders say, well, we've marched that way for hundreds of years, so we must always be allowed to march that way, even though the people in the area don't want them to march through it. And that's really what happened. The government, through the Parades Commission, had said, no, you can't march, and they said, we're going to march, and there were riots and so on. And I began to think, well, I wonder, does my next door neighbour think that that's what I'm like? Because a lot of these people that were shouting to march, these Orange men, wouldn't go to church. The other 50, one of the people that was on the barricades belonged to my congregation. And we'd been away on a family holiday the first time there was the riots. I think it was 93 or 94. And I remember coming back home, because we heard about it when we were in France camping, and I came back home, and the first pastoral visit I did was to this guy's farm. And he couldn't wait to tell me about being on the barricade, and and I said to him, Jimmy, what were you doing on the barricades? And he says, I was standing up for my faith. And I said, Jimmy, you wouldn't know faith if it bit you on. And I said, you're never at church. I said, you come to church for funerals, and you come at harvest, and you're shouting about wanting to go to church on a Sunday. And that was, I'm not saying that was true of all these Orange men, but it was true for him, and I think, others. So that really challenged me as to what am I, what can I preach on? So I remember one Sunday I decided I was going to preach on the Good Samaritan, and where the guy in the story that Jesus told was beaten up and left for dead, and these religious people came and they walked by the other side, and then this one guy, the Samaritan, and the Samaritans were the bad guys, they were the Catholics, and he went over and helped this guy up, so I preached on that, and as I said, I had two churches, and it was a 10:30 service, and I think it was and 12 noon, and I preached in the first church, and they were quite mixed, there were a lot of mixed marriages, and they liked the message, because what I said was, what if that guy on the road was Jerry Adams? Or what if he was the guy that had done the Garvaghey Road? Brendan, there was Brendan Rice was in Belfast. He did the same thing. But anyway, I actually literally said to my congregation, what if that was Jerry Adams, or what if it was this? Would you go over and pick him up? And so I applied it that way. So in the first church, when I was shaking hands with people at the door, they said to me, are you going to preach that in the other place? Because it was, the Orange people. And I said, well, yeah. And literally one of my elders says, well, we're going to be praying for you. So I said that. So I drove and I preached the same sermon. And nobody walked out, but two of the Orange men, at the end of the service, walked past. They wouldn't shake hands at the door. They just blanked me. They just walked out. And one of the guy, Jimmy, that I told, his son, who was married, he and I got on okay, and Thomas came to me afterwards, and he said, Jerry Adams would have loved that. And, that was criticism, of me. And I said, well, Thomas, I didn't preach it for Jerry Adams. So I mentioned that's one incident, because I was beginning to think, well, there's no point in me getting up here and preaching nice little stories if it's not going to change, and if people are still going to go out and riot and do all this stuff, and that's where my thinking was going to, and I came to the trust. I've got to speed on. The job was advertised, and I applied for it, and I got it. I mean, they offered me the job, and the end of this month I celebrate 10 years. I've been there 10 years. and our building, it used to be a Presbyterian church, a congregation worshipped there, but because, as you see from the map, it's in a Catholic area. The Presbyterian Church closed it in the early 1990s, and my organisation, which was founded in 1983, we're about to begin to celebrate our 25th anniversary. We had bought the buildings and had done some refurbishment, and then they advertised for a director, which is where I come on the scene. And when I was offered the job, well, during the interview, and when I was saying to my management, well, what do you do in the community? Which comes back to your question. And they didn't really do anything. We did some childcare, and that was really it. We did some employment stuff, and that was really it. So here we were. I first day at work. I'll tell you a story on the part of the journey. I was offered the job. I accepted the job, and I was given a start date of the 1st of May 1998. So the chairman said to me, why don't you come down before you start, come down a couple of weeks before you start and meet the staff and get to know them. And so I did that, and he said, come down on a Wednesday. We have a prayer meeting on a Wednesday afternoon at 4 o'clock. Come down at lunchtime, have some lunch and meet the staff. So I came down, had some lunch, met the staff, walked around, and it came time for the prayer meeting, and this old lady came in the door, and the chairman introduced her as Sister Carmel. The nuns had a house right beside the building. And he said, Sister Carmel comes to the prayer meeting. And again, as with the Holy, I'm not over dramatizing this, I thought, I can't pray with a Catholic nun. I'd never prayed with a Catholic, much less a religious. And I'd felt very much that this was God's calling to be in this place. But then if it meant praying with a nun, even though, given the journey that I was on, I still wasn't ready for this. So I thought, how do I get out of this? I've accepted this job, but I can't. And then I'm thinking of my peers. I'm thinking of guys I studied theology with. If they heard I was praying with a nun, so I got this dilemma. What do I do? So I didn't want to offend the nun, and I thought, well, this is what I'll go to the prayer meeting, and I'll pass myself at the prayer meeting, and then when I get home, I'll phone the chairman and say, I've obviously misread God's leading, and I'll say I don't want to go. So we went to the prayer meeting, and I don't know whether she was the first to pray, but I was really tense. I'd never heard a Catholic praying, The nearest I got was to that little old lady in our joint chapel, and she prayed, and it was a lovely prayer. And she prayed to Jesus, she didn't pray to Mary, and she didn't need a statue, and she didn't have any rosary beads, and she just prayed this beautiful prayer. And I remember thinking, and whether it was God telling her, I don't know, but anyway, I remember thinking, what were you, what's the big deal? Here's a woman of faith, So I decided to take the job, and I'm real glad I did, because she ended up being a really good friend. I mean, quite often the prayer meetings, we don't have them. We don't really have them so much now. I don't know what that says about me, but anyway. But quite often, she and I were the only ones met for prayer. Some of my management would come, and sometimes I got to own up. I would only know it was time for the prayer meeting when Sister Carmel arrived at the door. She moved to Dublin several years ago because she's quite elderly. But she still sends me cards a couple of times a year with a little Bible verse to let me know that she's praying for me. So I came to the trust. First challenge was, how do I engage with a Catholic community? How do I engage with a Republican community given my background? And what I did is, as Bill has done in his, I was just honest with people. I would meet them and I would introduce myself and I would say who I was and where I was brought up. And the message I was trying to tell people in those days, and it's still a valid message, the issues that they're wrestling with in the New Lodge are the issues that people in the Shankill Road are wrestling with, and the issues that I had grown up with. How do you pay the rent? How do you keep your kids off drugs? How do so I started telling people that, and anyway, I just began to engage with the community, and we had these big buildings, and it's a very long story, but amazing things happened that I didn't plan, people came and asked could they start an Irish school, for example. And Irish, as in Gaelic, that seemed to be a very Catholic thing, a Republican thing. But I got my management to agree to that, and they started that. And so local parents were coming every morning to leave their kids off, and they were coming into the cafe that we'd opened that was then being run by a local woman whose husband had done time, you know, who were a unashamedly Republican family. So, and Sadie would make tea and coffee for people and cut up baps, bread. You don't get baps. Well,
it's like the top of a hamburger.
Crusty bread. And she would cut it up every morning and butter it, and and so the parents would drop their kids off in the front room, and I didn't even have to go out on the street anymore to meet people. I would just sit and drink coffee, and they would come in, and I would have conversations with them, and the school grew. It's now a fully fledged school. It was the first Irish medium school to come under the auspices of the Education and Library Board, and I'm proud to say I'm one of the Board of Governors at their invitation. But what that did, the school starting up and Sadie taking over the cafe, for the first time local people thought, here's this former Presbyterian Church, we can use this place. We're now open 7 days a week. We still only run a preschool playgroup and after school. We have a big disability project and youth project. I work with young guys from the area. And we've probably about 14 other projects that are run by autonomous groups. You know, we don't control them. They from Alcoholics Anonymous to Narcotics Anonymous to Irish Dancing, Alternative Education Project dealing with excluded young people, the pensioners, the senior citizens have a dance every Saturday night in the hall. So we're open literally seven days a week, every day of the year. You know, there's an AA meeting in our building every single day.
It's the only Presbyterian church I've ever seen that has a boxing ring.
And there's a boxing club.
I mean, a real boxing ring.
There's a boxing club there that's very active. So there's a whole list of projects that go on, meeting needs. One of the things that we've become really good at is providing a home for people with special needs, people with disabilities, and people who are caring for people with disabilities. They seem to. We have a disability project ourselves, but we've got projects that do art therapy for people who have had strokes. We have had people who have had head trauma injuries. They come in. So it's an incredible place. You get all sorts of people with all sorts of issues coming and just mixing and getting along.
Would your clients be nearly all Catholics?
About 75%. We reckon there's something like 800 people using the buildings every week. And probably 75%, because of where we are geographically. Presbyterian Church have just given us access, literally it just was refurbished on one of the major interfaces between the New Lodge and Shankle Road, another Presbyterian church that they closed down, and they came to me several years ago and they said, when we close this church down, they said, you're doing things that we can't do as a denomination. Do you want this building? So we haven't got it exclusively, but we've got access to it, and that allows us then to form partnerships with people in the lower Shankle and do some other neat stuff.
Have other people around the north come by and said, we want to see what you're doing and try to do the same thing? Have you already seen pre-planning?
We get a lot. We get a lot of visitors. In most weeks, we have one or two groups. We sometimes get church groups, and I often say to them when they come, you know, we're glad you're here. You might find what you don't want to do, because there's a lot of stuff we do is scary stuff. And I was sent to the group yesterday. When I was being interviewed, one of the interview panel talked to me about the principle, succinctly, is less control, more influence. He said, of course, but in church circles, we have to control things. I mean, we're paranoid about that. You know, it's like a drug. We've got to control things. You know, and if we're going to have, whether it's bowling, not 10-pin bowling, whatever social activity you want to think of, churches can do it, but they always have got to control. They've got to elect the committee, and the committee have got to be made up of people who go to church, you know, because you've got to control. And this guy said to me, less control. I said, you know, I know. But that's true. What I've discovered is these. So we basically have our first mission statement that we formulated when I came. If somebody establishes a need, you know, if they come to me and say that, Bill, there's a need in the community, whether it's the immediate New Lodge community or the wider community, here's the need, will you help us meet that need? And sometimes they come and they say, here's the need, here's how we're going to meet it. Can you give us a room? Like the AA group, they came, they were being evicted from their building that they'd been in for over 20 years. And they came and they said, we hear you've got space here, will you give us a room? And that was like 9 years ago. So I gave them a key. They pay us a nominal rent to cover heat and light. But that's as far as they don't want me in at their meetings. They run the meetings themselves. And that's, so when church people come, particularly, I often say to them, you might like this, you may not like this. Quite often they don't like it, because when I tell them, you can't control these things. You've got to give people that space. Because when well-intentioned people, Christian or otherwise, traditionally have tried to tackle poverty or social justice issues, what they've done is they've taken the power themselves. They've run the programs, they've staffed the programs, and what they actually do is they make these people dependent upon them, so that if they're not there, those needs are not met. And of course that's a game, that's a control game. So we'll provide this service, but you're dependent upon us, and part of the deal is you come to church. And the community development principle is you don't do that. You basically empower people to meet those needs themselves, so that if you're not there, the need continues to be met. And that's the message that we preach. We got to. You've been very patient.
Do you get a lot of Catholic lay people that come in and want to talk to you or challenge you about your theology, that actually want to sit down and are curious about you and have conversations?
How has the Catholic Church responded to you?
Well, not just Catholic lay people.
Just
but
Catholic lay people.
how-
Well, let me clarify. One of the first things I did when I started, the two priests whose parishes I work in, I rang them up, and I said, look, I've just taken over as director of the trust. I'd love to have you up for coffee. Would you come and talk? And the priest from one of them, St. Patrick's, he came up. The other priest didn't come. He made some sort of excuse. But I pursued him. I went to him. I said, can I come to you for coffee? And we're now friends. I said yesterday, we support the same soccer team. So we're good friends.
Manchester United.
So what I did, I said to both priests, look, I'm not here to proselytize. I want you to be clear on this. I'm not here. I'm not a wolf that's come amongst your flock. I hope that we can work together. And so I have good relationships with the priests. As far as, come back to your question about Catholic, that happens sometimes informally. I've never had anyone challenge me. The really nice thing that happens quite regularly is people will come to me and say, would you pray for me? Or I'm going through a situation, would you say a prayer? In some cases I've prayed with people, but only if they've been comfortable with that. There've been a couple of people in the AA, Alcoholics Anonymous, where they've come to talk to me about family situations, so I let them know that and we're always looking for ways, and I'm sort of hesitant because I don't want to be seen to be pushing a brand of Christianity. I came up with a phrase. I'm going to be having breakfast with a good friend of mine in Dallas at the end of the weekend in a conversation. I made a throwaway statement one day. We were talking about what I was doing. This is several years ago, and I said, I'm trying to promote Christianity without labels. And he says, you need to copyright that. He says, you need to copyright that. He says, that's a great phrase. So I've sort of, so that's what I try and do. So we're always looking for ways to make prayer available to people, I could talk more about that, but I mean, there's never been a confrontation situation, because from day one I've been very clear that I'm not there to hopefully I'm bearing some sort of witness to Christ, because come back to the point that for me Christ was about compassion, and my staff are mixed. I should say that I've got Protestants, Catholics. I get some who go to church, some who don't go to church on both sides. But what I try and work with them and and we had our AGM, our annual general meeting 2 weeks ago, where all the groups get to talk a little bit, and it's really great because we've got all these groups that have come. And there's none of them ever say, we're glad we're here because you're a Christian organisation. but they all mean, that's what they mean. You know, they phrase it in different ways. They talk a lot about the unconditional acceptance they find in the place, which for me is just, I mean, that's just music to my ears. They talk about the ethos of the place. They talk about, in some cases, they talk about the love that some of them talk about the special atmosphere.
Did they ever talk about the suspicion they might have had at the beginning? Or not? I mean,
So-
it must have been.
oh, there was a lot of suspicion. I mean, I think I told you a story about being in the pub. A couple of years after I'd been there, we were in it was our Christmas, and being in a pub as a Presbyterian, that's pretty radical too. So you're going to have to edit that, you know. I wanted you
These people have been at pubs, in fact.
yeah, it's different here, but back home we're still very puritanical. But we had our Christmas night out in the pub, and a friend of mine who'd been doing some facilitation work with us. I said, look, why don't you come for a drink with us? And so Sadie, who ran the cafe in our place for a long time, was with us, and Eddie just asked that. Eddie said to her, I wasn't part of the conversation. I was talking to someone else, and Eddie said to Sadie, and it says Sadie comes from a Republican family, so she's connected. So he said to Sadie, "What did you make of this guy? You know, this Presbyterian minister coming in?" And Sadie says, "Oh, we were suspicious, you know, but we had him checked out." You know, so they've, you know,
How did they go about doing that?
she didn't enlighten Eddie, and I didn't ask. But I know, because of the people that I've talked to, that they obviously had me checked out, you know, and just obviously realised I was just crazy, and I wasn't sinister, you know, and I wasn't special branch. They thought I was special branch. That would be a branch. That would be a wing of the security services, you know, like your CIA. So they thought I was special branch, like a spy, you know. But they quickly realised I wasn't clever enough to be a spy. So it's a great place to work. You'd asked me during the break. Then can I jump onto that about how we do peacemaking?
Yeah, pretty bad.
Again, having established some degree of credibility in the area, and they realised that I wasn't a threat politically or ecclesiastically. On a couple of occasions, quite a senior Sinn Féin guy who was part probably of the investigation, because he would have been around the place. He rang me up one day, and he said, "Look, Bill, we need a room for a meeting." And I said, "Well, what size of a room and what sort of a meeting?" And he said, "Well, I got one of my, you know, and I don't want to say on, but another senior Sinn Féin figure in the area, so has set up a meeting with his counterpart, a loyalist counterpart, because there was tension. There were riots every night, and there were still. This is after the Good Friday Agreement. There were houses being petrol bombed in the Protestant area, and one of the Protestant paramilitary groups said on one of those occasions, that if another Protestant house was petrol bombed, they would start shooting Catholics again. So this meeting was called. I didn't ask what the meeting was for. I never did. I said, "Well, okay." And I didn't even tell my management committee. I just made a room available for these two. So they arrived. The guy that phoned me was one of their minders, and another guy arrived. What he told me was the guy from the loyalist area wouldn't go anywhere else, and the Sinn Féin guy was too well known to come in to a loyalist area. So they came to our place in what is now my office. So I had this bizarre. I made coffee, and I put the coffee in the room for the two guys, and then I sat with their two minders in my office, and had coffee, and we talked about football, and we talked
Minders
soccer.
would be like their cards, right? They're people that
Or their drivers.
Yeah.
So, and we talked about everyday things while these two guys did what they did. And after, I think, an hour or so, the meeting was over and they went home. This was like late on a Friday night. And at that stage, you would know, we were like less than 100 yards from the main army base in Belfast. It's on that map, you know. So there was all sorts of concerns of listening devices and stuff. So I didn't tell anybody. I didn't tell my management committee. I didn't tell my staff. I didn't tell anybody. So this happened a couple of times. And then during the Holy Cross...
They don't know about Holy Cross, I don't think.
Well, very, very briefly, because it's a whole story in itself. There, on the map, if you want to see it later on, I'll point it out to you. There's a small Catholic girls' school in a Protestant area, and the kids come from a Catholic area to get to the school. The Protestants in the area felt that they were being abused going to the shops and so on. So in order to get their own back and in order to raise awareness of their problems, they decided they were going to blockade the road and prevent the parents walking up with their kids. So all that summer, trained and experienced mediators who did this for a living tried to get the two sides to work something out, and it didn't happen. And stuff was leaked out to the press. So on the very last day of summer recess, as you call it, this contact in Sinn Féin that used to phoned me up, and he said, "Bill, a meeting has been arranged tonight between the Protestant protesters and the Catholics, and the Catholics want you to come with them as their mediator. What do you think?" And I said, "Well, I have no training in mediation. I said, but it's something that I've been praying about. I mean, and this makes me sound like very holy. I'm not. But it was something that I and lots of people have been praying all summer, that there would be a resolution. So I said to him, well, I can't very well have been praying about something and not be willing to so okay. He said, that's fine. They had someone from the Northern Ireland office phone me like half an hour later, the government. And they said, have you been asked to mediate at a meeting tonight? And I said, yeah. Who asked you? And he says, what are you? He said, what sort of... I said, I'm a Presbyterian. So they couldn't figure out why Sinn Féin and would want me. So they seemed satisfied. They were paying for the room that the meeting was going to take place in. So the guy from Sinn Féin had asked me to come that afternoon to Ardoyne and meet the three people that were going to come from the Catholic side to meet the Protestants, which I did, and we talked about what they wanted out of the meeting. And they simply wanted to know, they wanted the Protestants to list their grievances so that they could begin to address those and so diffuse the situation. So anyway, they also asked, could I pick them up in my car and take them to the meeting, which I did. And we met for over 5 hours that night. But the Protestants were determined that they were going to protest. On Monday morning when school started, they were going to protest. And several times we adjourned the meeting. and I said to the guy that came, who was also a Presbyterian minister, which was so you have two Presbyterian ministers at this meeting, sort of trying to mediate. So I said to the Presbyterian minister, I said, no, you need to tell these people that if they go ahead with this protest, it's going to be a PR disaster. I mean, they're going to be seen as Protestant bigots attacking Catholic kids. So he came back after a couple of minutes and he said, Bill, they don't care. And I said, it's crazy. So we reconvened and I put to them a compromise. And I mean, because I could go on and on, but I put to them what I thought was a reasonable compromise, which they threw back. They said, no, we're not going to do that. We're going to go ahead with our protest. And I then said, well, could we meet, have your protest on the Monday morning, and can we meet again on Monday night? No, we can't meet on Monday night. Can we meet on Tuesday night? No, we can't meet on Tuesday. They're also, so Wednesday night was the first night I could get them to agree to meet again. Monday morning was just horrendous. The Protestants lined the road, the police forced them back, and the kids with their parents came up this tunnel of abuse. And the Protestants were spitting on them. They were shouting at them. I could go. I mean, some of the stuff is just there's been a couple of books, but there's a really good book because I get mentioned in it, which is nice. Anne Cadwallader is a journalist, and she did a lot of. She interviewed people on both sides, and it's just called Holy Cross. But it catalogues what went on. It was just horrendous. BBC did a documentary, and I cried. This is months afterwards they aired this document, and I cried. I saw this grandmother, this Protestant grandmother, shouting at these kids, calling them the most awful things. It was just horrendous. This is September 2001. So Monday was awful. Tuesday was worse. Wednesday they threw a pipe bomb. Now they didn't throw it at the kids, but they threw it near the kids, and it exploded. Now newsreel footage, they caught it, and that was it. The Wednesday night meeting was off. The Catholic they couldn't meet under those, and that went on for a couple. And I was getting friends in the States emailing me, phoning me, saying, "What on earth what is going on?" And the only thing that put it up was 9/11. That was the only thing that got it off, the headlines here. Because I was getting calls from all over the US. The reason I tell you that story was we had this map. I had scheduled a day retreat, I suppose, with my management committee that about 2 weeks after it. We would have looked, twice a year, we would have looked at where we were at as an organisation and what we were doing. And at this stage, we really didn't know what we were doing. And that's the director saying that too. We didn't know what our role was. And so anyway, we had a room in a hotel over near Queens, the Malone Lodge Hotel, booked for the day for me to be away with my management. And normally I would have prepared a paper and presented it for the direction. That day I didn't. I just put that up on the wall. And I put that map up on the wall. And I said to my management, I told them, I hadn't told them about the Holy Cross thing and what I was doing. Some things they're better not knowing, So I told them, and I said, but we've been looking for like 6 months. We've been asking. I said, what's our role? And Sinn Féin have identified a role. Here we are. I come from an orange area. Here we are in a green area. I've got these links into all these orange areas. I said to them, we're meant to be bridge builders. So we've got to be peacemakers, and I don't even think I could have quoted chapter and verse, but I said I believe that's what we're meant to do. That's our calling, and so we kicked that around all day. Well, what does that mean? What are the implications for us as an organisation? What is it going to mean? So anyway, at the end of the day, I said to them, look, I'm firmly convinced that this is what we're meant to do. This is our unique selling point in marketing terms. This is our call. I said, certainly this is my calling. I said, I'm convinced that this is what I'm back in Belfast to do. I said, but you're my bosses. You pay my wages. You either agree or not. And I didn't. It wasn't that I was giving them an ultimatum. But thankfully, at the end of the day, they said, well, okay, yeah, so let's tease that out over the next couple of months. So it took us a while, but from that day, more or less, building peace, promoting reconciliation became our, again, marketing terms, our strap line. And we set about doing what we now do. Up until that point, and for quite some time after that, our method of peace building, which was your question, we just tried to get Protestants and Catholics together for any reason. This is a part of the city where Protestants and Catholics don't meet. They go to their own schools, they shop in their own shops, they have their own leisure centres, swimming pools, depending on which area it's in. They just do not meet, apart from the young people who riot on the interfaces where orange and green meet. Ours was the only building, and still to this day in North Belfast, ours is the only community building or not-for-profit building that Protestants and Catholics can meet in. So different things began to happen. Just after that decision, two women, and I told this story at length yesterday, 2 women came to see me. They rang, could they come and see me? One was Elizabeth, one was Susan. And they introduced them. Elizabeth says, I'm a Catholic. Susan's my friend. She's a Protestant. We both have kids with Asperger's, or I think I was told Asperger's, which is on the autistic spectrum. Yeah. So they both had boys who were autistic. They had Asperger's syndrome. And I'd heard of the phrase, but I didn't know what it was. And they spent the whole morning telling me what it was and talking about their struggles, talking about their joys. and then when I got Elizabeth can talk. That's probably rich coming from me, but when she paused for breath at one stage, I said, "But you want me to do something? You come for a purpose. What do you want?" She says, "Well, we want a self-help group for parents, and we came here because we don't want a Protestant group or a Catholic group, because that's what happens. I mean, if the government have an initiative, they set one up in a Protestant area, and then to be fair, they set one up in a Catholic area. So it's dual funding. But what that also does, that reinforces the division, you know." But they said, "Look, we're already friends, Susan and Elizabeth. We're already friends, so we want a group where we can both come." And I said, "You can have a room tonight. You know, you can start tonight." And then he said, "But we also need a place for our kids, because we can't get babysitters. You know, we get a babysitter one week, but they don't come back. So we need a youth club for the kids." Well, she didn't call it that. We need something for the kids to do. So I said, "Well, that's going to take a bit more time. We got to. There's health and safety. There's stuff." So we took 6 months out, and I worked with them, and we recruited some people, psychology students from Queen's University. We got some of my own team trained up, and a youth club. The first evening in they're going 4 years now. Started with 5 parents and 5 kids, and then now got over 50 parents, over 50 kids. The parents have their group meeting in the cafe on the site, and the kids have a youth club in the rest of the place. They run wild. You know, they got a big hall to run about in. They got a quiet room. They've got different things going on, and it's all run without any funding. There's no funding. These parents do it, and we've given them an office. And the parents have a clinic every Thursday, so that if other parents are having their kids diagnosed and then statemented and trying to get education and stuff, they'll come and meet these parents who have been through the system, and they're the experts, and they work with them. And our peacemaking has been like that, because you've got a group of people, like 50 kids and 50 parents, and then their whole network of friends, and they don't care whether she's Catholic and I'm Protestant. All they care about is their kids who've got Asperger's, so they've got the same thing. So we look for commonalities. We look for people who like to play soccer, you know, football. So I bring kids together from the area that I work with, and I bring them together with kids from the church that I worked in, the Shankill, and they play soccer, they play football. Our preschool kids, it's now so that's we did that. It was fairly ad hoc. And it was in the softer age, but I tend to think we used to talk about building peace one person at a time, because these people, and then they would go home and they would talk. They would go home to their segregated areas, but then no longer could somebody badmouth a Protestant to this Protestant, because they would say, "Well, no, hold on a minute, I've got Protestant friends," and same with the Protestants. If their friends were badmouthing Catholics, they would be able to say, "Well, hold on a minute, I've got Catholic friends. You know, we meet at the trust," and so, you know, all that was going on, and we would have any meetings for any whatever reason. I mean, I didn't care. I mean, if people could bring Protestants and Catholics, I mean, they could play tiddlywinks. You know, we didn't care. And then about 4 years ago, the Community Relations Council, which is sort of semi-statutory, sort of government funded, they came to me and they said, because I had got to raise my salary with everybody else's, all the rest of my staff. So they came and they said, "Look, why don't you apply for your salary? You know, we recognise the work that you're doing. Why don't you apply?" So I applied the first year and they turned me down because they didn't have enough money. And I reapplied next year, and then they've been funding most of my salary since then. But when we got the first year's salary, it created that space where I then said to my management, "Look, we need to start working strategically. You know, this bit that we're doing, I think it's effective, but we need to start working strategically." So I went away and got some funding from the Community Relations Council again, and we employed a guy to work with us a couple of hours a week. And at the end of that year, we were able to launch. So in February 2006, we launched this document, our Community Relations Strategy. President Mary McAleese came up from Dublin specifically at our invitation, and she launched this and made some really nice speeches, and said at that stage we were doing stuff that the politicians weren't doing, which was true, you know. So there are 10 specific aims with a whole list of related objectives in that, Then we got funding last year to actually implement the strategy. So it's no good having a document. So I went to another organizer, and so although it says 2006, we really only started rolling this out last autumn, last fall. So I've now got a Russian guy who's married to Belfast. He's my good relations officer. He's a great guy, and he and I work together closely, rolling this out. Generally, it's his, but we bring in people, and but what we do is, like our preschoolers, we twin them with preschoolers from a Protestant area, because all our preschool kids are from that area, and therefore they're Catholic. So we twin them with a Protestant preschool, and they go to the zoo together, or they come to us for a party, and we get a magician, and we have cakes and stuff. And you got parents then buying into this, you know.
How far away did the Protestants come from?
And they would come from the lower Shankill, Crumlin Road. And last year we twinned with a group from Protestant East Belfast, off the Albert Bridge Road. Same with our after school kids. These are kids 4 to 11. We twin them with Protestant groups, and we do all sorts of stuff. And then I'm always looking for, I was in Washington DC last month with a group of clergy. Government paid for it, which was great. And I visited the Holocaust Museum. I've been there before, and I bought some really neat books and great posters about tolerance and respect. So we've got these all over the complex now about what do you stand for, and it's really cool. And I got these kids' books hardcover, you know, about not hurting people with our hands and not hurting with our words. And you would think it was written for Northern Ireland, but it's all about teaching respect and tolerance. Because we've also got we've got a growing number of people of colour coming into Northern Ireland for the first time ever. So we've got Eastern Europeans, a lot of Poles. We've got Indians. We've got Pakistanis. So we got Hindus and all. So, and in our preschool, we got 4 Hindu kids. We got 1 Chinese kid. I mean, this is amazing stuff, you know. So you know, all of a sudden we've got all these other. So it's not just orange and green anymore. You know, and that helps, you know, because they realise the world is a lot bigger than that.
How far do you radiate out into Belfast with this program?
With our program?
Yeah.
I mean, our disability program, for example, we pretty much, I did a map for a funder, that was the last thing I did on Thursday. One of our funders in Australia, I sent away a funding proposal, and what I didn't use that map, I used another map, and what I did, I put a star with the kid's first name on it, and we pick up literally everywhere you see on that map, we pick a kid up at some stage in the week. So we've got a Seamus. I was going to say with no Billy. I said to my coordinator, I sat down with my coordinator, and I said, "Tell me who you pick up." And we pick up Patrick there, and we pick up somebody there, and we pick up some. And what I really wanted to make the story brilliant, we wanted a Seamus and a Patrick, and we wanted a Billy and a. But all the Protestants have got like one's Brittany, and they get all these exotic names. You know, they get. You know, I thought, well, you know, could we? But anyway, I stuck with the names that they have. But we've got stars right across, and actually beyond, we got pick up 1 kid from Andersonstown. These are all kids with special needs, you know, and we've got a young carers group that's just awesome. I can say it because I don't take any credit for it. But we pick up right orange and green. And I tell the story in the funding proposal. The first stop that our bus makes on a Wednesday night is in the Lower Shankill. There are 2 brothers with special needs, and the street has got UVF flags year round. UV Ulster Volunteer, you okay? Protestant paramilitary. The next, they pick up another girl on the other side of the Shankill, and then they go through Northumberland Street onto Upper Springfield into the falls, and the next they pick up a guy, Joseph, and his mum has some learning. I mean, it's a really sad family. But the garden, I don't know whether they give permission. The garden has been turned into an IRA memorial. You know, you've seen them. You know, they've got a Celtic cross. And the garden is an IRA memorial. So you got 1 kid in a street with UVF flags. 2 stops later, they're picking up a kid whose garden is an IRA memorial. It's in the falls. So that's what I did on Thursday. I wrote this up, and I did the map, and I sent it off to Australia. Because they fund us year on year, but they want something to fund.
Are there any other facilities like your own in Belfast?
Because I'm far enough away. I could say no, because there's no, with the dynamics that we have going on. I mean, even my own involvement, I suppose, as an ordained Presbyterian minister growing up, there's nothing like that. There are other projects that do childcare, and there are other projects that do really good stuff. You know, there are projects that do sexier stuff. You know, with working with, I do some work with paramilitaries. I'm involved at the moment with an initiative with the UDA in conflict transformation, because I know one of the senior UDA guys. And I was asked to come on this body that is going to hold them accountable to moving away from violence. We're involved in some other stuff with but we don't do those. And even though in our strategy we talk about doing it, but we realise that there are other groups doing that sort of stuff, and there's no point in duplicating just because it's there. So we complement stuff that's going on. So there's really cutting edge stuff.
Why don't other groups succeed? I mean, I know a lot of them are trying all sorts of things. They don't seem to succeed in bringing community people together.
Because people are still resistant to come. They still don't feel it's safe. I still got people. I was asked this question recently, and this is where this other building on the interface is going to help, because it's just across the street from the Lower Shankill estate, so Protestants can walk into it and be safe. I've got people who won't come to our building, Protestants who won't come to our building because it's at the top of the New Lodge Road. And there's still that stigma. I mean, you mentioned, you know, that it was the most dangerous. So there's still that issue for a lot of people, and we accept that. I mean, and that's not something that you can force. So what we do then, we do outreach. We work with groups. But I tend to think that given what we're doing and the fact that we're using an old church, which is also really good, you know, and we've got space. I mean, we've got a fantastic garden. We've got a barbecue. We've got climbing frames. We've got trees. For an inner city place to have trees, you know, so the kids can do environmental stuff, you know. So yeah, there's no one like, for sake of the there's no one like us. You know, we're totally unique, and we're solving all the problems in all around.
There's some truth to that, though. I mean, I've been, you know, yes, you have a question.
Seeing how you founded this, or you moved there, basically right when the Good Friday Agreement was came into being. Over the past 10 years, do you see the peace as being sustainable? Do you think that they've made strides to continue peace, or do you think that it's still very shaky?
Repeat that if you would.
Do I think the peace process is stable enough to hold?
Yeah.
Is that a fair reflection of your question? I think it's fragile, you know, but I'm convinced it's going to hold. I mean, whoever is in charge. I mean, Paisley's stepping down next month, you know, as First Minister. Peter Robinson will take over. That will bring in a new dynamic, and there will be no doubt there'll be some posturing, and you know he's going to try and seem, and this seems weird, he's going to try and appear a little bit more hardline than Paisley. You couldn't have said that a year ago and not be laughed at. But it will hold, because the vast majority, I mean, like 99.9% of the people, we've had peace, effectively peace for, well, the ceasefire's 94, little breakdown 96. We've had peace for over 10 years. Nobody, apart from the fanatics, you know, and
why will it be sustained?
Because well,
people sick of it.
People are sick of it. There is not the will, and I mean, I think this is where Gerry Adams was astute enough to realise that because the Troubles only lasted as long as they did because there was maybe not involvement, but at the very least there was a tacit approval on the part, particularly the nationalist community. And you might want to come back to me on that. But that's the only way that their war against the state could have been sustained, if the majority within the nationalist community at least gave it their tacit approval. Okay, they wouldn't have been involved in the shooting and so on, but they realised, you know, that no longer exists, you know, and Gerry Adams realised, I think, long enough ago that couldn't be sustained. So apart from the few dissidents, largely on the Republican side, who for whom Gerry Adams is as much a target as Paisley would have been, probably more of a target. so there is not the heart for the war that there was. People see some prosperity coming. They can now socialise. You can go into a bar and not be afraid of getting blown up. You can actually meet in the city centre. It's normal. I mean, it's a prosperous, exciting place, and people don't want to go back. So that in itself will sustain it. Our politicians, although they're trying to take credit for it now, they have no right, because they did not build the peace.
You must have thought a lot about this, and we've talked about it before, but what differences do you see in the psychics of the two communities? Why are they so different? Do they think differently? Do they believe differently? Do they, make some generalizations?
Well, and these are going to be generalizations, and I'm open to be challenged. And I can personalize it. I mean, I grew up, and Northern Ireland was my country. It was a Protestant country. The police were Protestant police, generally speaking. The government prior to civil rights, as I say, there wasn't an opposition, worth naming. Generally within working class Protestant communities, you didn't need to be educated. The school that I went to, no one ever went on to university. You just went in. You went into the shipyard, or you went into heavy engineering, or there was no. You didn't need qualifications. You were pretty much guaranteed a job in those days. So that all began to change. I mean, the civil rights movement, they were saying, look, this isn't right. When the Catholics kept quiet, you could be oblivious to those issues of social justice and discrimination. You could live your life oblivious to that. With the start of the civil rights, that's where people on the Protestant side began to get scared, because it was destabilizing the state, and people, Protestants, felt threatened, and understandably so. The status quo was being challenged. So when the war happened and Protestant paramilitaries rose up, they could lay claim to the fact that they were protecting their community from the IRA. That was.
Well, didn't the IRA come up to protect their community from Protestants?
Both made they made those. But I'm talking. I'll come on to the niceness of the Catholic community in a minute. But I mean that the UDA would say, that was their reason for it. I mean, and I was there. I was almost enlisted through sleight of hand and fleet of foot. I escaped. When they were recruiting, because I lived in a different area from where I went to school in, so I was able to, and the UDA both didn't get on with one another, so I was able to, but my friends all joined. Well, most of my friends joined. My closest friend joined up, and their raison d'etre was, we're going to protect the community. When the war then escalated and these guys started to go to jail for bombings and shootings and killings, and then when they come out, they were coming even into working class communities. They weren't hailed generally as heroes in the main, because they were, whatever they claimed for themselves, they were viewed as thugs and gangsters by their own community, which is one of the reasons why Protestant paramilitaries, when they stood for election, in the main, didn't, with one or two exceptions, didn't do well at the polls. You contrast that on the national side, when Sinn Féin began to put themselves up for the ballot, but you can see their vote increasing every time, because there was that tacit approval, not so much for the violence, but for their aims, the overall aims, reunification and all the stuff that went through that. So in the Protestant side, the state was theirs. And you didn't do anything to destabilize that. And the nationalist side, they from the partition, they didn't belong. They felt they didn't belong, and they either opted out or they were deliberately disenfranchised. You can choose whichever scenario you want.
We're down to the last minute or so, and on behalf of all of you, because I know you agree with me, to thank Reverend Bill Shaw for coming here. I mean, what a class this has been. Thank you very much.